A security guard found Thomas Mitchell unconscious in the Family Feud studio parking lot at 1:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Not passed out drunk, not sleeping. Unconscious. Face down on the asphalt, 94 degrees, wearing a full army dress uniform with medals pinned across his chest. A folded piece of paper clutched in his right hand. The guard called 911 and then ran inside to get help. Steve Harvey was in the middle of pre-show warm-up for the 2 p.m. taping when a production assistant sprinted onto the stage and whispered something in his ear. Steve's face went white. He handed his microphone to a confused crew member, walked off stage without explanation, and ran through the backstage corridors to the parking lot. When he got there, Thomas Mitchell, 71 years old, decorated Vietnam veteran, wearing every medal he'd earned in 2 tours, including a Purple Heart and Silver Star, was being loaded onto a stretcher by paramedics. Steve grabbed the lead paramedic's arm and said 4 words. "Where are you taking him?" The paramedic said, "Piedmont Atlanta Hospital." Steve said, "I'm riding with you." The paramedic started to protest. Steve was already climbing into the ambulance. He looked back at the studio entrance where his producers had gathered, confused and panicked, and he shouted 7 words that would shut down production for 3 days. "Cancel the show. Cancel all of them." It was August 6th, 2024, a Tuesday afternoon at the Family Feud studio in Atlanta. 4 episodes were scheduled to tape that day: 2 p.m., 4 p.m., 6 p.m., and 8 p.m. 360 audience members were already seated for the first taping. 2 families were backstage in wardrobe getting ready. The crew was in position. Everything was running on the precise schedule that kept game show production profitable. And Steve Harvey had just abandoned all of it to ride in an ambulance with a stranger. The producers stood in the parking lot, watching the ambulance pull away, trying to process what had just happened. One of them pulled out her phone to call the network. Another started walking back inside to inform the audience the show was canceled. A third picked up the piece of paper that had fallen from Thomas Mitchell's hand when the paramedics moved him. It was a handwritten letter, 4 pages, shaking handwriting, addressed to Steve Harvey. The first line read, "I came here to thank you before I died." But nobody in that parking lot knew what was about to happen. The ambulance ride took 14 minutes. Thomas Mitchell regained consciousness after 7. He opened his eyes, saw Steve Harvey sitting next to him holding an oxygen mask, and said in a voice rough from dehydration, "You're supposed to be taping a show." Steve said, "The show can wait. What happened to you?" Thomas tried to sit up. The paramedic pushed him gently back down. "Dehydration, heat exhaustion. Probably haven't eaten in a few days," the paramedic said to Steve. "His vitals are stabilizing, but he needs IV fluids and monitoring." Steve looked at Thomas. "When's the last time you ate?" Thomas closed his eyes. "Sunday. Maybe Saturday, I don't remember. Today is Tuesday. I know what day it is. Then why haven't you eaten?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The ambulance sirens wailed around them. Finally he said, "Because I spent my last $43 on a bus ticket from Chattanooga to Atlanta to come thank you in person. And I didn't have money for food and the ticket." Steve's hand tightened on the edge of the stretcher. "Thank me for what?" Thomas looked at him directly. "For saving my life 2 months ago without knowing you did it." The ambulance pulled into the Piedmont Atlanta emergency bay. Paramedics unloaded Thomas and wheeled him into the ER. Steve followed, ignoring the hospital staff who tried to redirect him to the waiting room. A nurse started to physically block him. Steve said, "I'm Steve Harvey. That man collapsed trying to get to me. I'm staying with him until I understand why." The nurse looked at Thomas on the gurney. Thomas nodded weakly. The nurse stepped aside. They took Thomas to a treatment room. A doctor arrived and started an IV, drew blood, checked vitals, asked questions. Thomas answered them mechanically. Age 71, Vietnam veteran, no current medications, no known allergies, diabetic but can't afford insulin regularly. Steve stood against the wall listening to a man describe a body held together by hope and falling apart from neglect. The doctor said Thomas needed at least 6 hours of IV fluids, blood sugar monitoring, and food once his system stabilized. She left to put in orders. Steve pulled a chair next to the bed and sat down. "Tell me why you came to see me," he said. Thomas looked at the ceiling. "You don't remember me. Why would you?" "I was just another face in a crowd." Steve said, "Try me." Thomas took a shaky breath and started talking. On June 3, 2024, Thomas Mitchell had been sitting in his 1998 Ford Ranger in the parking lot of a Walgreens in Chattanooga with a loaded .45 caliber pistol in his lap. He'd written goodbye letters to his daughter, his son, his ex-wife. He'd sealed them in envelopes and left them on the passenger seat. He'd been sitting there for 47 minutes, working up the courage to pull the trigger. He had late-stage diabetes with complications, neuropathy so severe he couldn't feel his feet, retinopathy that was slowly blinding him, kidney function at 38%. His VA disability was $2,100 a month. His insulin, medications, and medical supplies cost $1,900 a month. That left him $200 for rent, food, gas, phone, everything else. He'd been evicted 3 weeks earlier. He'd been sleeping in his truck. He was 71 years old, a decorated combat veteran, and he'd decided that dying by his own hand was more dignified than dying slowly in a Walmart parking lot. He'd turned on his truck radio while he sat there with the gun, some background noise to make the moment less silent. And the radio had been playing a podcast. Someone had left it on that station. The podcast was an interview with Steve Harvey talking about his father's military service, about how Jesse Harvey had come home from Korea and worked himself to death in coal mines, about how the country had used him and discarded him. Steve had said something in that interview that reached through the truck radio and grabbed Thomas by the throat. "My father told me 2 weeks before he died that the hardest part of his life wasn't the war. It was coming home and realizing nobody cared that he'd survived it. He said he felt invisible. And I told him, 'Daddy, I see you. I've always seen you, and I'm going to make sure other people see you too.'" Thomas Mitchell had sat in that truck with a gun in his lap and heard Steve Harvey's voice saying, "I see you," and something had cracked open in his chest. He'd put the gun down. He'd turned off the truck. He'd sat there crying for 20 minutes. Then he'd driven to a library, used the public computer, and found the Family Feud contact information. He'd written a letter explaining everything: the diabetes, the eviction, the truck, the gun, the podcast, Steve's words about his father. He'd asked if there was any way he could come to a taping, not to be on the show, just to sit in the audience and thank Steve in person for stopping him from pulling the trigger. The show's audience coordinator had responded 3 days later. They didn't normally accommodate individual requests, but given the circumstances, they'd arrange a ticket for him for the August 6th taping. Thomas had spent the next 2 months planning. He'd sold what little he had to raise money for the trip. He'd stopped taking 2 of his medications to save money for the bus ticket. He'd eaten as little as possible. On August 5th, he'd taken a Greyhound from Chattanooga to Atlanta. 9 hours, $43. He'd slept on a bench at the bus station. On August 6th, he'd put on his full dress uniform, the one he'd worn to military funerals and Veterans Day ceremonies, the one with every medal he'd earned in 2 tours in Vietnam. He'd walked the 4 miles from the bus station to the Family Feud studio in 94-degree heat because he couldn't afford an Uber and didn't know the bus routes. He'd arrived at 1:30 p.m., dehydrated, starving, but determined. And at 1:47 p.m., his body had simply shut down. Steve Harvey sat in that hospital room listening to all of this, and his face went through every emotion a human face can hold. When Thomas finished talking, Steve was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You walked 4 miles in this heat, in a full uniform, without eating for 3 days, to thank me for something I said on a podcast I don't even remember recording." Thomas nodded. Steve stood up and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room for 30 seconds. When he turned around, his eyes were red. "Let me tell you something," he said. His voice was rough. "What I said about my father wasn't a performance. It was the truth. And if those words kept you from pulling that trigger, then every single thing I've done in my career, every joke, every show, every stupid celebrity moment, was worth it just for that." He pulled his phone out. "But we're not stopping at a thank you. You came here to survive. We're going to make sure you do." He dialed a number. It rang twice. A woman answered. "Steve?" Steve said, "Becky, I need you to arrange long-term housing for a veteran. Atlanta or Chattanooga, his choice. And I need you to set up a monthly payment that covers all his medical expenses, insulin, supplies, everything. Use my personal account. This isn't going through a foundation. This is me." Becky started to respond. Steve cut her off. "Do it today. Text me when it's done." He hung up and dialed another number. A man answered. "Steve Harvey? What can I do for you?" Steve said, "Richard, I need you to find out if there's any VA benefit this man isn't receiving that he should be. His name is Thomas Mitchell. He's a Vietnam veteran with a Silver Star and Purple Heart. He has late-stage diabetes, and he's been living in his truck because his disability doesn't cover his medical costs. Someone somewhere dropped the ball. Find out who and fix it." Richard said, "I'll need his information and authorization to—" Steve handed the phone to Thomas. "Tell him yes." But Steve wasn't done. He made 4 more calls in the next 15 minutes. By the time he finished, Thomas had an apartment in Chattanooga starting immediately, with rent covered for 2 years, a case manager from the VA calling him within the hour, an appointment with an endocrinologist at Emory University Hospital to review his diabetes management, a benefits attorney reviewing his entire VA file for missed benefits, and a prescription assistance program that would reduce his medication costs to less than $200 a month. Steve sat back down and looked at Thomas. "You're not going back to that truck. You're not eating 1 meal every 3 days. You're not choosing between insulin and food. That ends today." Thomas was crying. "I can't accept all this. It's too much. I just wanted to say thank you." Steve leaned forward. "You came here to thank me for seeing you. Now I'm seeing you. And what I see is a man who served this country in a war nobody wanted, came home to a country that didn't care, and has been surviving on $200 a month after paying for medicine that keeps him alive. That's not a personal failure. That's a national disgrace. So you're going to accept this help, and then you're going to help me figure out how many other Thomas Mitchells are out there, so we can find them before they're sitting in trucks with guns." The doctor came back with food, broth, crackers, juice. Thomas ate slowly, carefully. Steve sat with him. The IV drip continued. Color started returning to Thomas's face. After an hour, the doctor said his vitals had stabilized enough that he could be moved to a regular room for overnight observation. They wheeled him upstairs. Steve followed. A nurse tried to tell him visiting hours were limited. Steve said, "I'll leave when he tells me to leave." Thomas didn't tell him to leave. They sat in that hospital room for 4 hours. Thomas told Steve about Vietnam, landing in Da Nang in 1968 at age 19. 2 tours, the friends who died, the ones who came home broken. He told him about coming back to a country that spit on soldiers, about trying to build a normal life while carrying memories of things no 21-year-old should have seen. He told him about his marriage, his kids, the divorce, the decades of working construction and factory jobs. He told him about the diabetes diagnosis at 54, the slow progression, the medications that kept getting more expensive, the choices he'd had to make. Steve listened to all of it. He asked questions. He took notes on his phone. He didn't crack a single joke. At 7 p.m., Steve's phone rang. It was one of his producers. "Steve, we've canceled all 4 tapings today. The network is furious. We have 360 people who traveled here for the audience. We have families who flew in to compete. We need to know when you're coming back." Steve said, "I'm not. Reschedule everything. If the network has a problem, they can call me directly." He hung up. Thomas said, "You canceled a whole day of shows because of me." Steve said, "I canceled them because you matter more than a game show. Anyone who doesn't understand that can find a new host." Steve made a call. A woman answered, "Steve, I heard you shut down production. What happened?" Steve said, "Mama, I'm at the hospital with a Vietnam veteran who collapsed outside the studio because he spent his last $43 to come thank me for something I said on a podcast that stopped him from killing himself 2 months ago. I need you to pray for him." Eloise Harvey was quiet for a moment. Then her voice came through warm and firm. "Put him on the phone." Steve handed his phone to Thomas. Thomas said hello. Eloise said, "Thomas Mitchell, my son told me what you survived. You listen to me now. You didn't survive Vietnam and 40 years of this country's neglect just to die in a parking lot. You're going to accept the help Steve is giving you. You're going to live, and you're going to help other men who are where you were. That's an order from a mother who buried too many soldiers' sons. Do you understand?" Thomas was crying again. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. Eloise said, "Good. Now, hand me back to my boy." Steve took the phone back. His mother said, "You did right today. Shows can wait. People can't." Steve thanked her and hung up. He looked at Thomas. "My mother just gave you orders. You're stuck with me now." Thomas laughed through tears. It was the first time Steve had seen him smile. At 9 p.m., the hospital social worker came in with discharge paperwork for the next morning. She had information about the apartment, address, keys being held at the property office, utilities already turned on, first year's rent already paid. She had the name of the case manager from the VA who'd be calling Thomas tomorrow. She had an appointment card for Emery. She looked at Steve and said, "I've been a social worker for 23 years. I've never seen someone get this much arranged this fast." Steve said, "That's because the system moves slow on purpose, makes people give up. We're not giving up." The social worker left. Steve and Thomas sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Thomas said, "Why did you really cancel the show? You could have just sent someone to check on me. You didn't have to ride in the ambulance. You didn't have to sit here for 7 hours." Steve was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because 27 years ago, I was living in my car. Different circumstances, but same desperation. And nobody stopped for me. Nobody rode in an ambulance with me. Nobody sat with me. I had to claw my way out alone. And I promised myself that if I ever had the power to stop for someone else, I would. You collapsed trying to get to me. The least I could do was meet you halfway." Thomas was staring at him. Steve continued, "And because you came here wearing your medals, you wore every single one. You walked 4 miles in 94-degree heat wearing a full-dress uniform because you wanted to show someone, that your service mattered, that you mattered. And I'll be damned if I was going to let you do that and then just send you back to a truck." His voice broke. "You deserved someone to see you wearing those medals and understand what they cost. So I'm seeing you, and I'm not looking away." The room was silent, except for the beep of the IV monitor. Thomas said quietly, "The Silver Star is for carrying 3 wounded men out of an ambush zone in Hue City in 1968. I was 19 years old. I thought I was going to die. We all did. But I got them out. All 3 survived." Steve said, "And 56 years later you were living in a truck because this country couldn't afford to keep you alive." Thomas nodded. Steve said, "That changes today." Steve stayed until midnight. He left only when Thomas fell asleep. He drove back to his hotel and sent an email to his entire production team. "Tomorrow we're filming something different. Be ready." At 9 a.m. the next morning, Steve arrived at the studio with Thomas Mitchell. Thomas had been discharged from the hospital at 8 a.m. Steve had picked him up personally. They walked onto the Family Feud stage together. The crew was confused. No audience, no competing families, just Steve and an elderly man in an army uniform. Steve addressed the crew directly. "We're filming something, not for broadcast, for record. Roll cameras." The cameras rolled. Steve and Thomas sat in chairs at center stage. Steve interviewed Thomas for 90 minutes. His whole life, Vietnam, the medals, the struggles, the truck, the gun, the podcast, the collapse, the help. Thomas told all of it on camera. At the end, Steve looked directly into the lens and said, "This is Thomas Mitchell. He's a decorated Vietnam veteran with a Silver Star and Purple Heart. 2 months ago, he almost died by suicide in a Walgreens parking lot because his disability didn't cover his medical costs. Yesterday, he collapsed outside this studio trying to thank me for something I said that stopped him from pulling the trigger. This footage will never air on Family Feud, but it's going out on every platform I have, because America needs to see what we do to the people who served us, and then America needs to fix it." Steve posted a 22-minute video to YouTube on August 8, 2024. The video was the full interview with Thomas, unedited, raw, devastating. Steve announced he was launching the Thomas Mitchell Veterans Crisis Fund, specifically focused on preventing veteran suicide through emergency financial assistance for medical costs. He was personally funding the first $10 million. The video ended with Steve saying, "If you're a veteran sitting in a car with a gun right now, call the number on your screen. We will help you. We will pay your rent. We will cover your medicine. We will make sure you survive. You didn't survive war to die alone in a parking lot. We see you." The video was viewed 417 million times in its first week. Within 72 hours, Thomas Mitchell and Steve Harvey Veteran Suicide were trending globally. The crisis hotline Steve set up received 38,000 calls in the first 5 days. Veterans, family members, advocates, all saying the same thing. This is happening everywhere. The fund's website received over 14,000 applications for assistance in the first week. Donations flooded in. Within 2 weeks, the fund had grown from Steve's $10 million to $68 million. Within a month, partnerships with the VA, veteran organizations, and medical assistance programs had been established in all 50 states. Thomas Mitchell's full VA benefits were reviewed and corrected. He'd been receiving 70% disability when he qualified for 100%. His monthly payment increased from $2,100 to $3,468. Combined with Medicare and the prescription assistance program Steve connected him to, his medical costs dropped to under $300 a month. He moved into his apartment in Chattanooga on August 12, 2024. Steve helped him move in. They hung Thomas's medals on the wall together. Thomas cried, looking at them displayed properly for the first time in years. 6 months after the collapse, the Thomas Mitchell Veterans Crisis Fund had prevented an estimated 247 veteran suicides through emergency financial intervention. The fund provided direct cash assistance for rent, utilities, medical costs, and food to veterans in acute crisis. Average response time from application to assistance, 48 hours. Thomas became the program's spokesperson, traveling to VA hospitals and veteran centers, telling his story. He ended every speech the same way. "I was holding a gun 2 months before I met Steve Harvey. Today, I'm holding a microphone. The only difference was someone decided to see me. Be that person for someone else." 1 year after the collapse, Steve Harvey and Thomas Mitchell appeared together on 60 Minutes. Thomas, now 72, looked transformed, healthier, stable, present. When asked what changed, Thomas said simply, "I stopped being invisible." Steve Harvey canceled a show to ride in an ambulance with me. That's not something you do for invisible people. Once I understood that someone saw me, I could start seeing myself again. When asked about the decision to cancel production, Steve said, "I lost a day of taping. Thomas almost lost his life. Those aren't equivalent equations. Anyone who thinks they are shouldn't be in a position to make decisions about other people's time." 3 years later, the Thomas Mitchell Veterans Crisis Fund has provided emergency assistance to over 41,000 veterans. The fund has a documented suicide prevention impact. Veterans who received assistance had an 89% lower suicide attempt rate in the following 12 months compared to the baseline population. The fund has expanded to include mental health services, legal advocacy, and long-term case management. Thomas serves as executive director. He's 74 now, healthy, stable, living in an apartment he doesn't have to leave. His medals hang on his living room wall. He looks at them every morning. Steve Harvey posted a photo on Instagram in August 2027, 3 years to the day after the collapse. It showed Thomas's medals on the wall, morning light coming through the window. The caption was 5 words. "Some people are worth stopping for." The post received 53 million likes. Comments flooded in from veterans sharing their own stories. The guns, the ropes, the pills, the moments they almost didn't survive, the people who stopped for them or didn't. A Navy vet from Oregon wrote, "I was in my garage with a rope. My daughter walked in. She didn't know what she interrupted. Your story made me tell her. We're getting help now." An Army vet from Texas wrote, "I've been planning it for 3 months. I applied to your fund today instead. Someone called me back in 6 hours. I'm still here." To date, the original video has been viewed over 700 million times across all platforms. It's been used in veteran suicide prevention training worldwide. It's been referenced in congressional hearings on VA funding and veteran mental health. A documentary about Thomas's story and the fund premiered at Sundance in 2026. The VA has since implemented emergency financial assistance protocols based on the fund's model. 3 states have passed legislation requiring expedited benefits review for veterans in crisis. The Thomas Mitchell case is cited in veteran advocacy training nationally. Thomas Mitchell rarely does long interviews. When pressed, he gives a simple answer. "I came to thank someone for saving my life. He saved it again, and then he saved 40,000 more." The lesson isn't that we need more celebrities intervening. The lesson is that veterans shouldn't have to collapse in parking lots to get help. But until the system changes, I'm grateful Steve was the one who found me. In the Thomas Mitchell Veterans Crisis Fund headquarters in Atlanta, there's a photo from the hospital. It shows Thomas in the bed, IV in his arm, Steve sitting next to him. Both of them are looking at something off-camera. Below it, a plaque reads, "The moment someone stopped." Staff members walk past it daily. Veterans calling the crisis line sometimes ask about it. Thomas tells them the story. The truck, the gun, the podcast, the bus ticket, the collapse, the ambulance, the canceled show, the help that followed. He ends the same way every time. "I thought I was alone in that parking lot. Turned out people were just waiting for permission to see me. Steve Harvey gave them that permission. Now we give it to everyone who calls." The game show runs on schedule now. Contestants play and laugh and win money. But everyone who works on Family Feud knows what happened on August 6, 2024. They know that sometimes production has to stop forever. They know that entertainment is fine until someone's life requires more. They know that medals don't belong in trucks. And they know that 360 audience members can wait when one man can't.